Well, it remains an honour to speak with the three of you, even though John can't be with us this morning and this evening. I did have a think about what might be interesting for the five of us to be in relation with, and you've asked me to share that, followed up by my sense of what might be interesting for the four of us to relate with, which is double the context, in a way. My orientation was very broad. It was to presence the apparent reality in our time of the existence of many gods with a big G. Certainly the perception of those that exist among different groups of people, and how that might influence the possibility for gathering in relation to understanding, in relation to cultivating trust. It's kind of curious how much implicit or given may be necessary in order to gather together and relate with matters of importance. By way of a little bit of a bridge, Jordan, as well as Forrest, I know you share this interest. Jordan, you speak about it certainly in my history of relating with your ideas rather front and center, which is the notion of collective intelligence and the criticality of dialogue in relation to that, whether a dialogic practice. I've come to relate to that context more through the lens of praxis with an X than practice, simply for the nature of it being that little bit more skin in the game, that little bit more contact in the sense of the unknown, but also the imminent real at the same time, in terms of what may or may not be appropriate to say and what one might be bumping up against or not. There's this reality of finding each other in the context of ecology sharing space, and that dialogue cannot always be held in a context where the space is held, although we can all hold that space together. Certainly if we consider a context where gods on the table, so to speak, might appear to be different, whether they are or not is perhaps a matter of interpretation, but to the degree then the perception that interpretation might be different, then how could we gather in a space that was totally held? In some important sense, that's the very thing up for question. And so it's been part of my learning process, I would say, to recognize that so much of the magic and the opening to potential for exchange and value creation in relationship takes place before the gathering itself. And so when it comes to considering how to open a context respectfully and appropriately in the context where there may be difference which matters, which might be influencing the possibility for the kind of exchange which seeks the wise. Certainly if we're seeking here a gathering where wisdom is welcome, and certainly I hold yourself, Forrest and Jordan, as two people who possess qualities of wisdom, and getting to know you, Joey, as well, I think it's more than appropriate you're part of this conversation. John, likewise. So that's some of my orientation coming in. That's a bit of a bridge between contexts. Obviously, John's work and history of relating with Jordan has been over many conversations, public and private, in relation to some of these topics. And so that would influence my orientation with respect to John being here. But otherwise, I know that there's a depth of relation and history of sharing understanding that exists between yourself, Forrest, and Jordan as well. So my orientation is really what is it to relate in the context of perceptions of what really matters appearing to differ in the context of global pluralism, in the context of information warfare and the parasitization of the communication commons, when apparently what matters most is that we might be able to hear and receive what matters to ourselves and each other. And so, Joey, I did have an intention just to invite you to share what drew you to reach out on Twitter, tag myself, Jordan, Forrest, and John in a tweet that was wondering, hey, could we get together? I think that might be interesting.
Yeah. So there was a number of things. So I've been following John's work since about 2021. I knew nothing about Forrest. I knew nothing about Jordan. I was like fairly new to the corner, so to speak. And I kind of ran into John through a conversation with that he had with Jordan Peterson. And so, but the depth that I got from John was just, it was not that Jordan Peterson doesn't have depth, obviously. I'm not going to say that, but it was just a different level of rigor that I experienced from John, but it was a totally different discipline as well. It was cognitive science. And so I watched Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, and there was one video that had Jordan on it, Jordan Hall, Jordan here. And they were speaking about there, it's like a brief series, but no, actually it was Jordan and Forrest and Smachtenberger. And there was a conversation of them on stage.
Oh, that's a long time
uh,
ago.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
position talk.
It was an old one. Like it was just something I had found. I was like, okay, I'm trying to understand, like genuinely trying to kind of grapple with what existential risk is, and just trying to contextualize everything, because Awakening from the Meaning Crisis made me realize, like, wow. So I had been sort of looking into these sorts of issues from a way less like rigorous perspective, if I'm being honest. It was just like um encounters in my world, where I'm from, you know, uh and my fiance and her dad, we I talked to her dad a lot about, he's a ex police officer. He retired about 2 years ago as well. And me and him sit down and we talk about, just the current state of our city and the issues that he's encountered, as well as like on the streets and within like the actual police department. He's very close with the um, chief of police, and very close with a former chief who has now moved into another position. But we were really close. And he has this program called the Bold program. And initially it's an acronym for bold, overt, leaders of distinction or something like that. But we always like, we can't stand it because he inherited that program with that acronym. So we were like reformulating everything and trying to actually address some issues. But that was when, around that same time, was when I encountered the video with Forrest and John, the one of the videos anyway. And that video I've watched probably, if I'm being honest, I think I've, over the course of the past 2 years, I think I've watched it like 10 times. Like, and I was just working, like trying to work with the actual text, the imminent metaphysics text. And I started to understand the modalities and the triples, and started to understand the axioms, and really acquainting myself and sort of trying to embody that, so that I could actually see this particular set of issues that we sort of want to solve here, um, from the perspective of actually being, if I could say, being what is within the text. And
Mm.
and that was very at first it was, of course, a challenge, and it still is. But it hasn't not. It's not that it hasn't yielded results, like highly impactful results. So, and that sort of oriented me towards I rewatched the video, and then I commented on a very specific post, and I'm not really completely recalling exactly what that post was, but I was like, yeah, this was a really good conversation. I can't wait until, I would really love, because I thought about it for 2 years. I was like, it would be really great if we could get John, Jordan, and Forrest in one context and, you know, kind of see what emerges from the relationships between them in a central context, even if, we don't have a outlined set of questions, or, you know, it just really, really struck me as something that I just genuinely felt and needed to say. And something that really impacted me a lot from Jordan was, at first I was like, okay, this is very difficult to follow, but I'll watch the video like 40 times if I need to understand what you're saying. I'll keep playing back parts over and over. I will take notes verbatim just so that I can lock in the information, even if I just remember it, just off of sheer, you know, constant repetition. I might not understand everything, but just the encounter with the information over and over and over and over, it puts me in a place where it's like, okay, now I can contemplate this. But uh, when I found out that Jordan had become Christian, it deeply affected me, because I'm Christian as well. And I grew up Christian, and I grew up Baptist, but I'm now non-denominational Christian, because I believe that, something you've been saying lately, by the way, Joy, I've heard you in a video say it, they all work together for the good. Like, they all of the denominations, it's that time. It's time for them all to link back together. They're not separate. They should not be separate, you know. And that impacted me quite a bit. And so I started to actually take seriously studying more theological texts. And, so, to not be too long winded, I just kind of, I was kind of going off there, but that's somewhat, a short form version of what caused me to say, like, man, this had been brewing in me for years, like 2 years. Like, I even went through all of those videos that you posted for us on YouTube. Um, I went through all of those. I could literally just send you my notes off of, and show you. Like, I sat and just, okay. Oh, you and Jim Rutt as well. I completely went, oh, game A and game B. I have so many questions about, you know, because I own a preschool. Me and my fiance own a preschool. So it's like, I'm trying to figure out how to not do too much game A stuff with what I actually want to do, because we're shifting from preschool to elementary, and then we're going to a private elementary, and then we're going to shift into a private elementary and middle. It's just a process. But I don't want to. I had a long conversation with Tim about this the other day, but you know, things like that. That's pretty much some of my orientation, like, and why I did what I did.
Cool. Well, Jordan, I'd love to hear your remarks. It's been a while since I've spent time with you, and I'm kind of looking forward to learning a little more of your experience in life. So I'd be delighted if you'd speak next.
Okay. That was a very good move. I was going to try to set it over in your direction. Yeah, well, I noticed a couple of things. How do you do this right? So what I noticed is there's a feeling, and it's interesting because I've learned this word the first way I would say it is a feeling of heaviness, but it's not a negative heaviness, because the proper word in Hebrew would actually be translated as glory in English. And so I'm noticing something like an intensity or a depth that is beginning to creep up on us. And even the presence and absence of John feels like it's there. So I can feel something that's a little bit scary, to be honest. So that's one. Second, Joe, when you mentioned what you and your fiance, by the way, congratulations and blessings on that, are up to, again, I think I felt it actually. I didn't see Tim's space, but I felt Forrest and I both kind of had a flash of the right word, something like, "Oh, all right, well, that means you got a little bit more of a sacred responsibility than I had been thinking about beforehand." And there's a gentleman, a friend of mine, a husband and wife in Tennessee, who I've had a conversation with, who also, they've been holding now for a while, like I think on the order of like 15 years, school and preschool and older. I think you all had a conversation. I'd be happy to introduce you on the offline. All right, I'm walking in. So the next one is, I recall that in the context, Joey put forth a kind of a provocative invitation. And I don't mean that in a mean way. I just mean like, wow, there's a lot of heaviness. There's something going on there. And what I felt though is I felt I mean, I like you. And I like you even though we've never met in person, but when I interact with you online, what I feel is it's all very good. It's all this positive virtues. I feel the work you just described. I feel it's there. Yes, good questions. You seem very thoughtful in the way that you're reacting to what's coming up. It feels like a conversation has a certain, like a comb filter or something in it. Like when you interact with it, a lot of the noisy stuff seems to deaden and it gets crisper. So when I thought about what you said, because you didn't include yourself in that initial, what I said was, no, if you're there, then it makes it a little bit, that starts to feel like it fits properly. All right. So now, Tim, you also threw in a little bit that was concerning, but also a little confusing. So what I heard was something like, all right, guys, so sort of we're in it now, or the big stuff is on the table. And of course, I saw the communion table, by the way. Big stuff is on the table. And we've been stretching out and limbering up and exercises on dialogue and dialogos and practice and praxis and all kinds of letters in the middle. But now it's game on. How do we actually do this thing for realsies? Because realsies seem like they're here, which is pretty good. Because I noticed I've actually been troubled with that. My ability now to sort of move into, how do I say? So as a Christian, I have like a differential that's been pulling at me. On the one hand, I have an actual direct commandment from God to find my way into relationship of love with everyone. And on the other hand, I have the entire construct of Christendom that doesn't have a harmony with everyone. In fact, the sizable fraction of the population it does, and even within its own fractures, as you pointed out, Joey, right? So that disharmony is now something that I can't simply just let be. Stuck, right? I have to actually find my way to actively step into it. And yeah, you're right. I have been finding this more and more and more. So within the context of non-denominational, there's an immediate awareness of, okay, we in the body of Christ have been called to love one another as he loves us. So that's a really heavy, okay. But then, there's a whole bunch of other folks even just in the context of Protestantism, there's a continuous what do you call it? Not a family feud, but everybody fighting over the Thanksgiving table, over the Thanksgiving communion table. But then I actually had an interesting, actually a pointed experience that I went to 2 weddings this summer that were Catholic weddings, which I had been to Catholic weddings in the past, but as a, what do you call it? Heretic. So first time I was at a Catholic wedding as a Christian, so I was paying a lot of attention. And I had the distinct sense that, yeah, they're Christians. There's Christ is present in this liturgy of what's going on. but I wasn't invited to the communion. And I felt improper trying to go to the communion based on the way that they described it. And I was like, okay, that's it. Like that's that edge. Where are we? How do the body is being called back together. There's something going on. This is just, I can't help it. There's just a sense I have that that's what's being called. And then, but that call is big. As that call begins to expand out through the particularities of what it is that has caused Christians to not be on the same page, it does not stop. It just continues to go out. And at that point, I now have all those, for me, by the way, it's has it been about 10 years, Forrest? Yeah. No, not quite 10 years. Not quite 10 years. But my period of time, I like the way you put it. So I'll use something like that description. My period of time in the desert of the immanent metaphysics, which has plenty of springs of water, and I agree with you. But a lot of those same instincts came up, right? You have these instincts of values and purposes, right? You have instincts of type 2 and type 3 coherence. There's a bunch of things that begin to pop up of, okay, a big part of the story of where we're going is that kind of a shift. We can be at cross purposes, but we can be with harmonious values. So I will then hand that off to Brother Forrest in my lower left corner, by the way. If I ever refer to geometry, that's where he sits.
Well, what a delighting setup. I love this notion that there's a beingness, right? That in effect we are each in one fashion or another, and John too, of course, would be included in this as well. Very much concerned in terms of our actions, our relationships, the way in which we do love in the world, the way in which we conduct ourselves in community and with compassion. And so there's a skillfulness that we seek in conversation. There's a skillfulness in which we hold one another in the bonds of care, basically. And so in this sense, as I hear the invitation to speak on ultimate matters, I heard Tim as partially asking something along the lines of, so what do you think of God? What about that? And then in Joey, I'm hearing some notions of, like how do we work with school and education, particularly with young children. And just so you know, I similar to Jordan, I have a profound respect for people who are teachers, particularly for those younger grades. And anybody who's durable enough to be a teacher in high school, and anybody who's essentially compassionate enough to be a teacher of grade school is already has really high marks in my esteem, and kindergarten especially. So just really want to call that out as something that I personally see as an expression of care and of high value. And Jordan, as I said, I have I'm glad to be able to sit with you again. It's been too long, and I'm hoping that we get to renew on occasion in some fashion, just to again further the friendship part without necessarily even having an agenda for that in any real sense. But nonetheless, when it comes to how do we bring doing into being, so that from that being new becoming can begin, right? That there's a triple there between doing, being, and becoming. And so in this sense, I hear a strong willingness on all of our parts to be engaged with the doing and to be in right relationship with that, but also to be in the being, to fully reside in ourselves as compassionate beings, as holding the fullness of the care that we have for life and for each other and for the world. And that from that space, from the depth of the skillfulness with which we hold that care, that is begotten this sort of miracle of change, this phenomenology of creation that essentially the future emerges from. So in a sense, I don't think of creation as something that happened long ago or in some faraway place, and that all the matter has just been interacting since then. I think of it as that the present moment is foundational, and that the future emerges out of the present. And so in this sense, when I hear the notion of something like, in that humanity, or that mankind, and again, I'm speaking of the species, not of men in particular, but just that humanity is essentially in God's image, is essentially to say that we partake of the nature of creation through the choices that we make. So if we're wanting to make good choices, if we're wanting to make wise choices, that we will come to repose, or to be in residence within that quality of being, that we feel and sift through the fullness of ourselves, so that both our thinking and our feeling and our emotions come together. They come into synchronicity with one another, so that when we act as a whole and complete being. And this wholeness extends beyond just the confines of our mere body. It can include our families and our communities, and the life of the world itself. If we are so deep in our being that we can be attuned and deeply in relation to that wholeness of being. And from this space, we can genuinely make wise choices. So in this sense, I regard that action of holding choice as essentially a kind of holy act, holy in the sense of being whole and creating wholeness. And also in the sense of, that a whole is a space in which there is transparency. There's like a perfected clarity. There's a space in which the light can come through. So, in this sort of way, again, speaking on somewhat religious themes, I mean, there's a sense in which you can walk into a church, for example, and you can, say it's an afternoon, and you can be standing, and you can look up at the rosary, and in effect, the light of the afternoon sun comes through the rosary and shines on the floor, and you can experience the light. You can experience the sense of the light coming through, and it's because of the transparency of that window that this happens. And that in effect, the more that we can become clear, the more that we can, in a sense, be in our being in a clear way, the more that we can feel the fullness and the wholeness, and the more the light of life can go through us. And our choices become infused with that creative energy. It becomes infused with that becomingness that the future emerges out of. And so if we wish to engage in divine choice, we are in a sense in embodying that divinity within ourselves. And so in this sense, we can talk about the immanence of spirit. And so, these aren't, there's a deep reason why I use the language of immanent, omniscient, transcendent. You can think of these as being three lenses through which we understand the notion of divinity. Like, in one sense, we can talk about the sense in which we ourselves carry the seed of creation, carry the seed of creativity in us through the choices we make. That this is an ethical responsibility, and we need to learn how to hold this gift that we have been given, to be in right stewardship with life. And in another sort of sense, we can think about divinity as essentially sort of like omnipresent and omnipotent. When we think about God the Father, for example, and again this sort of Aramaic sense that there's essentially an all-knowingness that goes with that, a kind of perfected objective view. That would, of course, be the omniscient way of thinking about divinity. Whereas in a third sense, we can talk about it in a sort of pantheistic sense. We can talk about it in a sense of, the God isn't just in myself. He's not just somewhere else looking in on us or such, but that in effect it's ever permeating in the totality of all of life, of all of nature, of the entire universe. And that this sense of, creation occurring and emerging from the microscopic everywhere at once, this sort of perfected simultaneity of creation, is a sort of transcendent way of viewing this notion of creation itself, of the sort of perfected ideal of generativeness. And so in this sense, we can think about the interplay of these three views of how we experience this notion of relationship between existence, interaction, and creation. And I think that reflecting on these things can really yield a lot of insight into what does it mean to make good choices? What does it mean to essentially be an embodiment of ethics, or an embodiment of beauty, of aesthetics, or of value? How do we hold the notion of beingness in the sense of ontology, or knowledge in the sense of epistemology, or value in the sense of axiology? And that effectively all of these traditions, Christianity being one among many, that they have answers to how to think about these sorts of things and why that might be relevant for us on a personal level. And so this sense of how do we bring the transpersonal back to the personal? These sort of ultimate conceptions of what does it mean to be divinity, and what does it mean to make choice, and what are the ultimate sense of the non-relativistic ethics, and how to actually practice that as an individual. So we come from this creation sense back into this sort of doing, the praxis of our daily lives. And so in this sense, it's funny, Joe, you describe sort of like a kind of brute force, almost academic approach to the discipline and the rigor of what I call the White Book. And there's this sense that I'm wanting to just call out that, actually that book was meant to be a textbook, like, to be held in the context of a learning in practice, in community, as a kind of guild, or as a kind of school, or some way in which, as you're saying, that some fraction of it, some relevant fraction, could be offered even to children. And that through this, they learn something of the sacredness of the gift of life that they've been given, and the ways in which to hold that in relationship, not just with peers, but with family and with community. So in this sense, I find that there's actually a lot of richness to be spoken of in this conversation. I mean, I can go farther into considering some of these ideas, but I feel that there are some definite common threads that holds us individually in this conversation, but also collectively in terms of what might be offered or offerable in this context.
That was excellent. Tim, did you want to say anything? Or both you and Jordan, you both had like just so many things coming to my mind, so many things. One of the things that more recently just came to mind while you were speaking was what my first encounter with metaphysics was like before I even ran into your metaphysics. It was like I went through a training period for dealing with complexity. It was like and it was not formalized. It was not like, like I learned this in school, or, I at a university, or it was an encounter with a book. And the book is called, and everybody who watches this, who knows me, is going to be like, oh, he's talking about the book again. But the book is called Thinking and Destiny. And that was my original encounter with metaphysics. And I'm always curious, like, does anyone know about this book? I can't believe
I have actually read that book. I know the book you're speaking of. I have a copy of it.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Forrest.
You could well imagine I have a very nuanced opinion about it. But on the other hand, let's leave that for now. Yeah.
It has its things, right? But there was something there that I felt some profound truth there. And that was what I got from that book, was how to encounter feeling, how to embrace feeling, and what feeling is aside from emotions. What is feeling? And actually inquire in the real way, asking within the self, like within that context, what is feeling? I've never asked myself that question before that text. And it initially gave me this jarring encounter where it was like, I don't know. Like, I don't know what feeling is. It, but it silenced all bodily representations of what that might be. It was like, nope, it's not that. Like, conscience spoke every time I was incorrect, but only in a sense where it said no. It didn't say, no, Joey, it's this. It was like, no, until I shifted into what feeling was. And it's not something that I can very well verbalize. It just is feeling. Like, it is that which in and of itself, its being is that which allows us to feel anything. And that is what we use to move through levels of awareness. It was like something like that. And that was my beginning of metaphysics. It started to crack so many things open for me. Nothing looked the same. Breathing does not look the same. What the senses are is not the same. Like, nothing is the same, was the same after I read that. But then I walked down the path with you, Forrest, and it was like, oh, I'm really shut in now. Now I'm really there. And then Jordan's work just kind of does this thing where it's like, yep, and that is here now, everywhere. And you should be mindful of the negatives and the positives. And but in hearing how you spoke about the responsibility, I want to say that responsibility started to weigh on me the way that it does now. 2018. The severity, the urgency. It I was willing to reach out to individuals who I was hoping would understand this, in my hometown, people I grew up with that I thought, might find it of value because they speak about, and I don't want to talk bad about them, but they speak about, developing the community. This side of town is, just under, and it's just a terrible place and all of this. But it's just kind of like, as soon as you offer some sort of philosophical solution, that was wrong. And I learned later, like, it's not always about the solution. Sometimes it's about the dialectic. And, it took me a while to learn that. I learned that thanks to John. Like, I read Dialect. I hunted that book down. That book is out of print. Dialectic and Dialogue is out of print. I hunted it down after watching After Socrates, and I found it, and I just had to pay my library for it because it's out of print. But Dialectic and Dialogue. So that was one of the texts, and it kind of got me to a place where I could dialogue without trying to get to some end, like, solution. Like, this has got to be the, I got out of that, and it was so freeing. I could now read the word much better. I could now see, oh my goodness, we won't even go into the triples in the word. Won't even do it right now, but it's like, okay, now I see. Like the word is not words as we've been taught in church. It's not like the written word. It is that which words refer to in some sense. But then I also encountered something else, which was like very freeing for me, which was like uh there's some kind of uh e- there's some area of connection between atheists. This has drastically changed my perspective. There's some kind of connection between atheists and theists, which was that one believes that they can say what God is, and then the other believes that they can say what God isn't. They can both believe that they can suppose the beingness of that which is not bound by being. if if we are to follow the, and that changed my orientation to things. Now I can, I can go into Genesis and read it very differently. I can think about context that I didn't. Okay, Moses, if Moses is writing this, you know, Moses is a man and he has beingness, and he is attempting to say what that conversation with Brandon Graham Dempsey or something like that. He has a particular perspective of like metamodernism and stuff. Jordan had a conversation with him, but there's sort of like this. How do you you can't necessarily fully comprehend like the word when it's coming to you or when you're reading it if you're not even able to take in the context of the person who's writing it. Who's writing this? Why are they writing it that way? Why does he even, under what authority is he, being directed? Like who's guiding him? Uh and so now, but now, I talk about it all the time, even in church or outside of church. Her father's our pastor. So and so is our mother. So um how do you properly encounter not just biblical texts, but just man in general? So now there's a book that I'm more recently reading, which is called Theophany. It's about Dionysius, his perspective of it, and it was incredible. And that was one of the insights from the book about the theists and the atheists and everything. And I'm kind of doing I'm riffing here, but in that I realized that there's a very there's something that we have to let go when we're doing this, when we're trying to, and it is that all things are going to end one day. I don't believe that. I don't believe that all things just shut off and there's going to be a discontinuum. I also don't believe that the God that I believe in is not like some sort of dictator trying to be like, yeah, okay, this person's doing that, and this person, it's nothing like that. And I also don't believe that I can say what my God is or isn't. I don't believe that I can say that with full confidence and honesty of heart and truth. I don't believe that I can say that. What I can say is that I encounter aspects of appearances of God. That's it. And those encounters with those appearances manifest my present responsibility. And then I can make moves accordingly. Oh, okay, this is presenting itself. I have a daughter who was born on the 8th, just born on the 8th, newborn. And yep. So, and it's just like there was this roller coaster of an experience this time, this is not my first child, but just this particular instance was like, just, well, one moment we're getting a C-section. Next moment, no, we're not. Next moment, yes, we are. Next moment, no, we're not. And then finally we end up having the C-section. And it's just kind of like appearances of deep normativity, deep, like, this is what is per se. But what is does not necessarily have to be that it is God. Like it is appearances of such. And I've just been sort of encountering it. I've been sort of dealing with that. But I've been having all of you guys' work to assist in my grounding within that. So when I start thinking about, okay, well, maybe my city's no longer going to be a city. And I need to start thinking about that. It might shift into something else. Maybe I need to start thinking about the EGP technique amongst my peers, and I shift into some sort of new I don't even want to call it problem solving per se, but if I have to use that terminology, it's sort of like a flowing. This is what I hear from Forrest, is like a flowing with what is. A flow, it's crazy to this just came. It's like a flowing and a knowing as it flows. It's not a knowing before it flows. It's not a knowing even after it flows. It's like a knowing as. And so that's kind of where it's taking me. And I'm just trying to figure out. I mentioned it to Tim the other day. Do I stay away from how, and should I even stay away from the more capitalistic perspective of the preschool, because that weighs on me a lot. Of course I have to pay for materials. I have to, the rent for the building, or, eventually I'm going to own this building. And once I own this building, I still have to pay, mortgage and all those things. Parking lot needs to be redone. Like, you have to pay for a sign, have to pay for marketing itself, is all of these things that cost money. How do I shift into if I was to ask Jordan, how do I shift into a more game B like take on that? Something just emerged too, but I'm gonna be quiet. I'm gonna be quiet. It was because it was something that Forrest has said. It's like you're gonna know it when you're being it. But yeah, that's where I'm at, guys. As far as that goes, pass it
George,
off to.
you could ask the question. It's up to you now.
All right, I'll take the ball. So, yeah, I've been working on this notion of trying to take the concept of faith, and I've been recharacterizing it back to its original Greek pistis to kind of help make the pill easier to swallow. But it sounds an awful lot like what you're talking about in terms of this feeling and this flowing and this knowing. So just that, I'm going to bridge those two things together. Since you're going to be spending time talking to a pastor, I'm going to say that's the way I've been learning how to practice it. Is that there is a cultivation of in fact what is in fact in us, right? This image of God that has been part of our beingness is a faculty or capacity to be able to flow with. And we can perceive something that guides us, that feeling, that the sense of feeling that allows us to learn how to surrender into the flowing witness, which, in our way of saying it, we could say we can learn how to listen to the Holy Spirit, and we can learn how to be guided by the Holy Spirit. And then this is the actual proper way to answer these kinds of questions. And I'll say it in a very theological sense. But if you're noticing that you're about to go toe to toe with one of the arch demons, Mammon, you probably better be on your cross pretty firmly. Because as soon as you get off that and try to handle that with your own understanding, he's got you, no question. And And of course, this is vastly easier said than done. Like, but beyond comprehension. In fact, to be very precise, I have personally deferred from taking on the responsibility of putting together a school of that sort because I know I can't answer that question properly right now. And I'll reinforce these folks I've spoken with. They've been through that crucible on their own first person. So I think that might be a really nice conversation. And I'd also, by the way, love to have some conversations about the way that you've been perceiving and using the triadic structure in the context of the word. So I think it'll be fun.
I would love that.
You hit a great note right there. I mean, you could feel it. Again, I've been having these conversations trying to help people understand that it's not a book. It's not even a good book. It's something else entirely. That is, in fact, something like the incarnation, or it is actually the Logos. It is the second person in the Trinity bleeding out onto paper so that we can come into relationship with God, right? That's what it is. And so, of course, it's infinite. So you get this, and I've had this experience now too many times of there's a point where I find myself suddenly opening up, like almost like a shifting of, I guess, the high dimensional lens that I currently am, and a whole other gigantic understanding just flows. I'll just, reading the same piece of scripture, reading it, and then boom, I just get blown wide open and completely blown out of who I am, right? That's the whole point. I get blown completely out of who I am, and somebody new comes back that is brought through that portal. And I think this is a lot of the response to what Tim tried to, the way he invoked it in the beginning. We're getting closer to it, and this kind of thing, this sense of this notion of faith, this notion of being in relationship with, let's say, the transcendent showing itself up in the present, and recognizing that that's what's happening, and learning how to be able to transform ourselves in that relationship until we, in fact, do become someone else in the encounter, and that someone else is, in fact, woven of the larger encounter. And that's the possibility that allows these larger, more meaningful things to be eaten in communion instead of at separate tables.
So I will pick up with that. I liked especially this notion of it's not going to be through some sort of comprehension, which would be an omniscient way of being. Like that, if we're going to come from a cognitive space or an intelligence space, we're not going to really be able to appreciate the way in which the transcendent flows into the immanent. And I think, Jordan, you really put that quite well. And I agree. I mean, I just basically think that it's just straight up, just a correct way to hold this notion of practice of we tune in, right? We basically develop a kind of sensitivity that is partially expressed in attunement, right? You described, using this symbolism, this vehicle of a book, to treat as a kind of logos, but not as a pattern in some sort of shape of space or some sort of sequence of words, but to really to be a vehicle for essentially developing a kind of attunement, and to try to describe what you are attuning to is to just sort of fall back into an intellectual perspective. It's not actually that helpful. So in effect, there's a sense here of wanting to develop the skill of attunement, and this goes back to something that Joey was speaking to earlier, which was essentially there's a sort of discernment that goes with that. Is this quote unquote my ego speaking? Is it someone else's ego speaking? Where is this sense of right motion? Where is the impulse to move coming from? And the willingness to be residing in that inquiry, to really be in the discernment of what's really relevant right now. What is the thing that is essentially the basis of my action or the basis of my care? What values am I embodying? And there's a sense in which that attunement and that discernment, when practiced together, does create wiser choices, does create a better sense in which we hold care. And so, Joey, in response to your question of like, I'm hearing from you this thing of, hey, I have this school. There are some real omniscient realities here of just like trying to navigate day-to-day choices around parking lots and signs and just, the usual phenomenology associated with anything that would be done in the world. And It isn't. I'm wanting to clarify that I'm not claiming something along the lines of, oh, we should never practice capitalism. Believe me, I do not want to go that far. That would be way too much. It would be a substantial exaggeration of my perspective. I'm more basically trying to point out, and this is where another trinity comes up that I've may have mentioned or you may have encountered that has to do with essentially, you know, care in the sense of how we hold love and how we hold relationships and communication and such, versus say transactional process, which we could think of as markets and capitalism and so on, versus what we might think of as power, which could be thought of as say things like governance or you're talking to a police officer and there's a sense in which some of our relationships, like if I'm going to a doctor and he's operating and he's doing a C-section, there is a certain power that is involved in that, and you're wanting to have that power be held in a fiduciary way, which is essentially is to say that the Hippocratic oath of the doctor is binding that power under care. And so in the same sort of way that if I'm in a relationship and I'm in a relationship of care, I want to be sensitive to not having that relationship of care be too quickly or too unconsciously superseded by relationships of transaction. And that relationships of transaction aren't too quickly or too unconsciously superseded by relationships of power. And that when we are in a space of holding power, because those of us who, in the Western world have been so endowed to be able to play the game of capitalism reasonably well that we end up with resources. And so there's a phenomenology of coming back to, well, why did we do this in the first place? Like, what is all the reason that, we became entrepreneurs and tried to make the world a better place? Well, there's a care underneath that. There's a care expressed in that notion, which if we lose sight of it, then the entire endeavor of our lives becomes empty. So in effect, there's a sense here in which, although modern technology is really good at increasing transactional process and increasing power-based process, because that's what technology does, that we as human beings is essentially a sort of embodiment of values that go beyond intellectual utilitarianism, can really hold a sense of a value ethics, can hold a sense of how to practice the skill of care, to practice care and love in a skillful way. And I would believe, given that we're all gentlemen a little farther along in life, that we have all experienced relationships with significant others, and that there is a sense in which we are deeply in the care of how to hold relationship, how to hold love and family, how to hold love and community, and to really treat these notions about religion and about spirituality as being relevant to the skillfulness with which we hold care. So in this sense, it's if I'm going to be responding to the question, and Joey, that you're sort of asking of, like, how do I balance this? Like okay, so it's clear that transactionalism is well held in the modern world, and it's clear that power is a dynamic that's already fully present in the world. How do we bring care into its fullness? That's the question that I'm really hearing as the center. It's not so much, oh, we're not going to ever do capitalism. We're never going to have, relationships where somebody's essentially issuing suggestions to another person as to what to do. It's going to be along the lines of that the skill with which we hold care in effect supersedes or is just stronger. It's just more rightly and well held, and that it isn't lost in the face of transactionalism or power dynamics. So in effect, it's a little bit like Jordan was just saying. You have to be really centered in yourself. You have to be centered in the truth. He's referring to the cross, which is a symbol, which effectively is like, yeah, I'm going to be in right relationship to spirit as much as I'm in right relationship to world and other people. And that, if you're able to hold that sense, if you're able to hold those attunements and those discernments really, really well, then you do have the strength to encounter the demon of capitalism, if I'm going to be so bold as to call it that. But the thing here is that there's a sense in which you're not going to be able to do that from a purely intellectual point of view. And moreover, you're not going to be able to do that from an instinctual point of view. You are going to need to incorporate an intuitive point of view. And so in a sense, there's even a skillfulness and a discernment of when are we responding from intuition, or when are we responding from mere instinct? You know, as embodied creatures, if we don't know what our instincts are, the instincts of survival or of sociality or procreation, that we're not going to necessarily be able to notice what our intuitions are, because we're so feeling so strongly driven by our needs. So in this sense, there's a skillfulness even in the sense of discerning between wants, which would be, you know, things in the outside worlds, you know, power, for example, needs, which are things entirely within the self, which would be instinctual, and things that are relational, which would effectively be, you know, what we might call, you know, passions or desires that go beyond just one's own sense of I want or I need, but into the sense of we care. And that's a whole different dimension of holding this. It's not what my passion is. It's what our passion is. It's not what my desires are. It's what our desires are. And the notion of our can extend beyond just self and into family, but into community and into the species as a whole, and into the ecosystem as a whole, and the world as a whole. And so in this sense, there's again a sort of fundamentalness to these skills of attunement and discernment, so that we can be appropriately skillful in the way in which we hold care. So, you know, there is an intellectual component. You know, I will say something like love is that which enables choice, and there's a lot of actual depth of understanding of that. But in effect, at some point or another, you're going to be in the presence of intuition. You're going to be in the presence of instinct, and you're going to need to be able to navigate those spaces with real discernment and real attunement. And I think that with that, the motion from the transcendent to the immanent is well held.
Joey, I got a question for you. In your church community, do y'all have a practice of confession?
No.
I'm going to go ahead and just be so bold as to recommend that you begin the process of cultivating something like that. And it's a non-trivial practice. Like, there has to be high symmetry. You can't have a single central. It's funny, mixing all kinds of language. You can't have a hub and spoke model where there's like one person, everybody else is confessing to them. And also, you have to be very clear that you're. Pardon?
Keep it from being centralized, like.
Keep it from being centralized.
Okay.
You also need to make sure that you're actually engaging in confession and not performance. But that the process of being able to actually rely on the fact that you have this incredible advantage, that you are actually held by love itself. That love itself is a personal relationship with you and is desiring deeply to deepen his relationship with you, means that in the act of confession, you can give up to God all the things that may be separating you from the choices that you know you want to make. And then so that process, that practice is a very, very powerful practice. And the absence of it from our denominations, I think, has been quite a hamstring. So it just came to my mind that you might be having the same situation that we're having on our side, and we are in the process of trying to figure out how to build that up ourselves.
Yeah, that's a really good suggestion. I've never really thought about it in that context. I've never even thought about it. Yeah, that's a really good suggestion. I really appreciate that, Jordan.
Jordan, just out of curiosity, is that confession between people in the community, or is it confession between oneself and divinity?
In point of fact, it ends up being the latter by means of the former.
Okay.
So you're having a direct relationship with a person, and you are confessing to God, and there is obviously the degree to which the confession is. How do you say it right? So absolution. I'm not sure. There's a lot of language here that I haven't got familiarity with this because it's coming from a different tradition than I'm part of. But the person I'm talking to they can forgive me if in fact I'm confessing my particular trespass to them, of course. But it's more about the fact that it's in the body. So, okay, let me be a little bit more clear. When we are gathered together, and we are gathered together in relationship of the Spirit, we are then, in fact, an embodiment of the body of Christ. And so when we are entering into a sacred space of confession, the other is already entered into communion with you in the body of divinity. And the confession is not just to divinity, but in some sense with divinity, in the constitution of the sanctification of all the individuals involved. In fact, I would just be precise to say, I have found universally that when I'm engaging in a form of confession, it is a public act, not a private act. What I mean is not, I'm saying it out loud, but rather that there is something going on at a corporate level that is more fundamental than what's just happening for me specifically. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
It does, although I want to clarify a little bit of how I'm hearing that.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I'm hearing, and this is connecting to something that I'm also holding quite dear to my heart as well. And this may seem unrelated, but it's actually about the notion of belongingness. So when I hear you speak of, in the embodiment of and how to hold that, what I'm hearing is essentially a notion of belongingness, and I use the word belongingness in a very specific way. So I think about it as being the continuity of the acceptance of one's authenticity. So those are the three ingredients, right? That in order for confession to be confession, it's got to be authentic, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if you're not even authentic about what it is you're confessing, if there's a lie about what you're confessing, then all bets are off, right? Okay, but then there needs to be an acceptance, and this is the piece of you're trusting the other person to not just be accepting of your authentic expression, and maybe forgiving or having a conversation as to what amends may be or so on. But there's a sense in which they have to hear your authentic expression in order for there to even be a communication event.
Mm-hmm.
And moreover than that you're hoping, and this is the thing that I think that is the practice we need to have with each other, is that acceptance is continuing, right? If some confession becomes scandal and it breaks and fragments the community, that's not a holding. That's like the sense of being the body of Christ that I'm hearing. Again, I'm hearing that in a symbolic sense, but I'm also hearing this in a very practical way, which is that, in a certain sense, we're looking to have a continuity that is stronger than whatever the travails may be that people have emotionally about a given situation.
Mm-hmm.
That the love field is stronger than the fear field, basically, and that in effect there's a practice in this. Again, I'm not trying to say, hey, this is the way Christianity meant it originally, but I am saying, hey, this actually sounds very sensible to me, and a very sort of like, here's a way in which it makes sense to me, and this is how I'm hearing you. I'm hearing you as essentially saying something along the lines of, when we become skillful in the practice of holding compassion for one another, holding community and care for one another, and developing a sense of depth in the attunement practices and discernment practices, that there's a sufficient level of strength in that we can trust to be authentically ourselves, and that the others, whoever you're confessing to or whoever you're talking to in the community or the group, is going to be accepting and continue to be accepting. That you won't have, hey, I can be authentic today, but after that it's over, or I can be authentic today but not tomorrow, or I can only be authentic about this but not that, right? That there's a sense in which you want continuity in time and in space and in possibility, so that there's an evenness in the way that the strength of the community is being held.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah,
so yeah, go ahead.
Yes. What I'm seeing is actually, it's funny. I think there's actually a whole kind of traverse through all the different aspects of the modalities. So on the one hand, the community, or let's say just the one who is witnessing the confession, I can rest in Christ. I don't have to hold the whole of what I am perceiving, because I know that ultimately at the end of the day, It is Christ to whom they are ultimately confessing. And I can trust, I have trust that Christ is infinite and has the infinite compassion. And that continuity that is necessary can be held, which is beautiful then, because practically that allows me, this is the difference between kind of the therapeutic sense, where the therapist is endeavoring to stand in the position of ultimately, in this case, literally being God, and therefore has to produce a variety of different techniques to metabolize that compassion into therapeutic techniques. I've actually noticed this and watched how it works. That's not what happens here. What happens here is that the community is resting in the infinite love. The community therefore has this incredible luxury of actually being able to be completely present and just witness the confession of the individual. The individual can also equally trust that at the end of the day, their confession is being held by divinity, and also therefore have confidence and trust that it will be held in perfect continuity. And that gives them the ability to be able to be relaxed into the confession before the actual people. And what this does is this creates a context that strengthens the embodied belongingness in the physical community. So your belongingness at home in the universe, in God's universe, is secure, and therefore your homeness in the community is strengthened over time.
Well, there's a lot there. I would definitely, I mean, like to the extent that we can, as a person in community, I want to create belongingness for others. I'm not presuming that I'm going to quote unquote be able to do that perfectly, skillfully, or in the infinite, but nonetheless, I'm going to take on, as much of that as I can as part of the holding of love, right? So in effect, there's a sense in that my service as a listener to another person's confession will be to hold that sense of love in a continuing way, to hold that acceptance of their authentic expression in a continuing way. And, as the confessor, of course, my belief or notion is that my authenticity can be held. And so in one sense, there's a notion here that, we're in a kind of reciprocal practice where, at some future point, if you're confessing, then my job is to create belongingness for you. And when I'm the confessor and you're the recipient, that you're creating belongingness for me, and that as we become each more of that for each other in the context of the multiple relationships that we each have with each other in community, that the community as a whole becomes strengthened as a loving community. So in effect, we can hold this, we can hold this notion of there is an infinite degree to which this skillfulness can be held, and that we're continually striving to become better and better at it.
Yeah, it gets softer. There's less charge as you sort of settle into it, because the natural state is actually much closer to this easeful lovingness.
Yeah.
Which is not to say that it's easy, but it's much more than when you're there. And there's actually an intrinsic or a built-in symmetry, so that, for example, in the act of confession, if I were to say to confess before the three of you, it wouldn't be an asymmetric burden that you'd be taking on, but rather what I have always experienced is that hearing someone else's confession relaxes or releases in me things that I have not yet confessed myself, that I've been holding, and noticing that is just part of the human experience. And also, again, feeling that presence of the divine reach in and go, and you are loved. Ah, okay. So, and that it becomes actually highly generative, right? It's not living at kind of a 2 level. It actually is operating at a 3 level.
Yeah. I think we're in agreement. I remember I was at the, it was, I'm trying to remember the name of the event. It was like some civilization thing, Emerge, I think it was called, in Austin, Texas, a few years ago, and I was at a dinner, and somebody was asking me, well, what is a practice that you're engaged with right now that is helping you to be in right relationship in this moment, and you're describing a situation which connected for me for that, which was, to not just to speak of humility, but to be willing to be engaged in humiliation, not of anybody else, but of oneself, right? That if I'm going to confess to something, I have to be willing to tolerate humiliation. And I have to have enough humility to be willing, so, I remember at the time I was sitting at this dinner and a lot of people are looking at me when I'm saying this. I'm thinking to myself, I bet you they're going to think I'm completely nuts because I'm basically advocating for a sense of willingness to be able to engage in a level of humility through a practice of humiliation. But I think the sense that you're describing it is actually much clearer, which is that there's a willingness to be in the kind of humility to be able to confess, hey, I make mistakes. Sometimes I don't get things figured out, and I'm willing to essentially to be continually in the love that holds me in such a way that I can continue to deepen the practice of not making mistakes, but actually becoming more and more loving. We can look at this not through the lens of judgment, but through the lens of discernment and through understanding what are the differences between judgment and discernment. Judgment is I make a choice to reject once and I'll never consider again, right? Whereas discernment is an ongoing practice, again and again and again to try to feel into rather than to think about, right? So judgment will be thinking about something. I've removed myself and I'm projecting, right? Whereas with discernment, I am feeling with in a continuing and ongoing way. And so in this particular sense, there's a lot of real benefit to not only distinguishing between judgment and discernment, but being in the practice of discernment such that we can transcend these artificial divisions of, well, did I confess or did I not confess? Did I make a mistake or did I not make a mistake? No, I'm continually in the approach of higher and higher degrees of attunement with those things which are, for lack of a better word, ultimate values, right? Like when we're talking about care and love and beauty and truth and those sorts of things. So in effect, you can think about divinity as basically being the asymptotic approach of perfected beauty, perfected love, perfected truth, for example, right? Truth, beauty, and goodness is the way the Greeks would hold it. And so in this sense, to the degree that we can become more and more willing to discern the ways in which we can be in better attunement to that, I think as you said, the more natural our human condition is realized, right? The more we come back into a kind of resting and repose in what is our quote unquote original condition, right? The innate goodness that is in the human at a fundamental level. Like when we're taking away all of the judgments and we're just looking at what is authentically the truth underneath all of this. There's goodness there, there's beauty there, there's truth there. So in this sense, that's again, I'm just describing to you how I'm hearing you, as you're expressing through a kind of Christian theology, I suppose. I'm hearing it through the lens of the metaphysics, and I don't see that there's really that much difference between what we're actually advocating for.
It's been a journey to listen to you all, and I've appreciated it. So I'm grateful for that. It's interesting noticing the feelings in me developing over the last about 5 to 7 minutes. I was flowing along quite nicely, and I'm still flowing. In the beginning of the conversation, Jordan, you said there was an energy you picked up on, a presence you felt. I forget if you used the word, I forget if you were calling in fear or concern. There was something of, I don't know if you said, it was like afraid.
Almost
I want to get
scary.
that right. Scary.
Almost
Right.
scary.
So there's obviously differences there. And so that's an interesting thing to remember. And I am smiling in wonder that I have apparently decided to remember that. Not necessarily what I want to do. I suppose it is in keeping with the spirit of what I am in dedication to, which I also take to be part of the flow that is present. And so here we are. It was interesting. I was writing a message to Forrest, and as I was doing so, I was reflecting on, of course, this conversation and many of the themes we've been with in the conversation, and they've unfolded in a way that is consonant with my sense of what was here to unfold. When you brought in the notion of confession, Jordan, I was thinking about something which I won't say is quite the same thing as perhaps, although maybe it's very much the same thing. I was thinking about something that I'm naming as similar as a transpersonal apology. And so there we are. And generally speaking, the articulation you gave of how you've known and are learning and participating in confession spoke to many of the dynamics that would be in play there. That relation to, in effect, Christ as a greater than of any particular body that makes possible it doesn't matter, there's no responsibility to hold all the water because the cup overflows, and it turns out that the vessel was not that fixed structure, at least the fixed image of it that you thought it was. There is a basis for continuity which makes possible the movement of energy in the context of belonging and change. And I'm hearing Forrest speak to many of these dynamics as well. One of the notions that I brought in the opening to this was provocative and uncomfortable to say, because I said, and I changed it afterwards to interpretation to some degree, but I said many gods. I said many gods. Because of course, we could be having a conversation with someone who might not have agreed to this conversation, accepting whether or not one is willing, in fact, to participate in conversation. The magic there is, in effect, already done, is the point I was making to begin with. And so, because of course there are many people around the world, however they might identify, that could take a different view of God and would not accept the words communion and Christian interpretation. And they might not care much for the immanent metaphysics placed alongside their own chosen books of ultimate consideration. And yet there is clearly tremendous tremendous value in many books of ultimacy that make possible coming into relation with being, in part because we are that which is of that. We are of that which can return to relation. It's helpful to have some guidance. One thing that was coming to me just before as a sort of provocational next orientation was something like a trans-religious confession. It seems to me that what aspects of religion must take seriously is the cultivation of orientation and capacity to open to confession without having first of all to agree, although perhaps this is the provocation, without perhaps having first of all to agree upon whose cathedral or whose holy structure such confession ought take place in? Or must it, is an interesting question. Like I'm not saying it must, but I'm making it as a provocation, because it would seem to me that to agree on a context in which to open up, but to do so in a way that is capable of, the word that comes to me here that I would often use in a slightly less theological context would be integrity, of kind of holding to integrity, which is really sharing in the context of uncertainty with respect to relational process. The reason I mention this is because we meet each other in a fractured place. We meet each other in a fractured world. And in fact, perhaps in this context, we can lean on the respect and trust we might have for each other in a way that is transcendent in part of any particular discourse that we might be using to connect in relation. This is not always possible. Or is it? Is there in fact something in the context of where discourse germinates? And again, this is a question. This is not me trying to insert something necessarily, but it is provocational in the sense of, before there was any book, what was there? Was there at some point sufficiency to communicate in such a way that was worthy of becoming penned in a book? Was that sufficiency sufficient for the kind of connection in the possibility of community that might hold well enough in the context of the difference and uncertainty and asymmetries of power that might be found out there along the way? And that question is a very difficult question to ask in many instances, when it perhaps is the case that those most studied in matters of spirit, and by study I mean, of course, a life lived, not only study, but certainly study, are often those who have come through lineages and care about their lineages, obviously, as they should. And yet, if I'm pointing to a problem that is fundamentally requiring something that is of a trans-lineage kind of commitment, then what does that mean for transmembranic expression, public and private expression, exoteric and esoteric expression, in the context of collaboration? And somewhere in there is often where I find myself to be, I won't go so far as to say trapped, but I would say in the context of inviting others with respect to the appropriateness and perhaps necessity of humiliation, as you've mentioned, Forrest, because that does seem to be something which comes through in the context of an asymmetry of power, but very much the presence of at least a sufficient intention to care. That the authority structure, the formal structure of support for that process is not present. And that to me is close to a deep tension. And John is absent in this conversation. There's certainly a pivot here, slightly more likely to the notion of the Silk Road. But I wouldn't want to, I'm not trying to channel the energy of all of this through that, but nevertheless, just to presence where some of the initial thinking was in relation, there are pieces here to bring in relation to that which have some historical counterpart which I am not educated enough to speak on. And so that is some of what I'm with, and I feel a bit of a relief in sharing that. Yeah.
I do want to clarify that I'm not advocating that people enter into involuntary humiliation. I'm suggesting that if one's spiritual practice enters to such a level that one chooses to do that, i.e. chooses to confess or chooses to be in humility or to be in the spiritual practice of that, that's something that they elect. Otherwise, you're looking at trauma there. So the other piece that I think I do want to clarify is that, given, first of all, I'm describing how I'm experiencing the recommendations Jordan is recommending and some of the questions that Joey is asking. But I don't believe I've said, hey, this text should be put beside the Bible or something like that. That feels I don't know. I'm not sure where that might come from, but I myself am basically I'm simply saying, hey, I'm a bloke who happens to live in San Diego, who is a philosopher and thinks about these kinds of things.
Technically, on my bookshelf, it is, but that's, I think, merely logistical.
Okay, good. Glad to hear. Anyways, but the other
double click on even that comment right there, just to properly clarify what I mean in relation as well. There's a subtlety there, but yes.
Yeah, we could certainly clarify that. But I hear in the background, I guess, this other sort of deeper question, and this is, I guess, maybe just to clarify that well before anybody learned how to write, clearly there were communities and tribes and relational processes that had spiritual and religious dynamics before anything could even be maybe conceptualized in words at all. Was there essentially a sense of community meaningfulness, of spiritual meaningfulness, even before people had proper language with one another, let alone written forms as we're accustomed to using today. And, I do think that in the sense one of the ways in which I hear and consider the notion of the word religion is actually in a kind of depoliticized sense of community of people holding care for one another, holding values together. Not the least of which is the value to live, right? So in effect, there's a sense to acknowledge that, yeah, it's not always going to be because of some intellectual understanding based on a book, but that there is a kind of practice that, I personally would think of as a kind of rehumanizing and renaturalizing that I'm continually trying to point back to.
Well, if I can just briefly respond, just to say that on your first two clarifications, Forrest, I understand, and I attempted to speak with the nuance to convey that understanding, but it's a very important thing to clarify. So I hear you and I understand. I'll give way.
There was like some sense in what you had, in everything that you had done, Tim. In some sense, that turned this context into a confession. Like you confessed, you went into this sort of humility that almost mirrored exactly what we were speaking about. It was incredible to see. It was like when you watch it back, you'll probably see what I mean. But it was like the fact that you were talking about it was one thing, right? But the content of the message matched the context to a degree that was almost like a 1-to-1. It was like, this is what we're talking about. This is what Jordan is saying will be done. It's like a quick question that came to mind would be, some of the questions that came to mind when Jordan made the suggestion was, how do you select who we might confess to? Another question that came to mind was, some sort of approximation of an answer was that it's not a credential based like thing, that shouldn't be credential based. That shouldn't be, oh, you're qualified to do confessions in this because you have this paper. It's like a real embodiment of one who could be a representative of that particular level of being that can do it. And they are qualified, whether you have the paper or not, you know, whether you have the credential or not, they are qualified. And it was like a moment of somebody actually being qualified right there, right then in that moment. But I have a couple of questions that came to mind about intuition. And I'm gonna just say a couple of little things that come to mind upon, you know, the terminology, like that particular word, like the way it sits. Intuition gives this sense of compensation from within of a sort, payment within. I'm going to use the metaphor that Forrest used earlier about light. And I'm going to take it through some levels, through something that I've learned as like a good, decent metaphor. There is the physical world, right? And, you know, we have your window. You know, I have my window here, and it is transparent enough that the light might pass through it. You know, the light will pass through it. If, you know, the sun comes up. You know, at night, my street lights will pass through, and, you know, the noise will leak through and all those things. I'm right next to a highway, but it's not that bad. So there's that, the physical level. The compensation for something physical is usually something physical. It's it's like money or whatever. You know, when we think about compensation, well, when a lot of people think about compensation, my encounter with them is usually like, oh, okay, you're talking about getting paid some money. Where the next level might be the psychic realm per se, or whatever you want to call it. It's like the psyche, where emotions and, you know, emotional regulation and desires and all of that occurs, that space. Compensation there, you don't give physical money. The right compensation there is not like, here's $1. You know, if someone gives you proper relationship, proper relations between, or your psyche and their psyche, the right payment, the real payment that you receive is actually psychological payment. Even if you pay the psychiatrist who saved you from whatever, you know, ailment, mental ailment, it's like, that's not you're paying them for talking to you. That's a physical thing, you know, so you have to give them the $1, right? But the actual psychological change that occurred, that is the compensation from within that occurs, that occurs from giving your attention to this individual, relating your psyche to this other individual's psyche, and allowing them to sort of, you know, do what they do. And then there's the next level of compensation, which is not, you know, feeling driven or desire driven. It's almost like reason, and it's like almost the embodiment of discernment, but it's not. It it's almost beneath discernment. But in this space, in that space, it's like, well, how do you compensate on that level? You compensate rationality with rationality, or, you know, reason with reason, or correctness with more correctness. Is like, what is that compensation? Like, what does that look like? So intuition to me seems like it is moving through, I'm just using those levels. it it looks different depending on the level. But as a human, you have all of those levels embodied within you. And it's like when we start to, instead of instinctually, so I'll just use like an example, or an example. Instead of using instinct to navigate, some text you might be reading or some conversation you might be having with someone, it's not just some kind of loose encounter where you're just talking about sports or something. It's like a real instance of dialogue that is occurring. What does intuition become? Like, what does intuition really mean there? Does it mean all of the choices that I made before in Forrest's sense, all of the choices that I made before are in relationship with each other within me, and I am a collection of those choices, and I'm now relating those choices to you guys, and there will be, whether I want it to be or not, there will be some sort of compensation within that emerges this new. It's sort of like, if I was to compare it to something, it's like what happens in dialectic into dialogos. It's like, oh, because you have this view and I hold this view and we've related them, this emerges. Something that neither of us could have come up with that we can now hold within ourselves. And then try, we can continue back and forth. It's like a compensation that is not just a physical it's not just a physical event. It's like a payment within. Like you have tuition in college, for instance, or whatever, or we even have tuition at the school. So but you have tuition, but in tuition is like, feels like payment within of some sort. There might be innumerable ways you can be paid within, but it seems like that. So my question is, what do you guys feel might be, Jordan, Forrest, even you, Tim, like, like what is your sense of the term, that term? And then also, what is your sense of the term forgiveness? Is it like a giving ahead of its earned nature, or a giving ahead of our perception of the fact that we've earned whatever it is? Or is it like that's where I'm coming? That's what I sense there.
So let me respond here. I'm going to be presumptive because I know Jordan would probably have a lot to say about this as well.
Yeah, yeah.
So speaking only for myself, when I'm using the word intuition, I'm using it in a way that really is actually quite different than the way that I'm hearing you think of it. So I'm wanting to contextualize how I'm holding that term, just so that there's not confusion between these two ways of holding that term. Are you familiar with Newton's laws by any chance?
Yeah, I'm a physics major.
Great. So object in motion stays in motion, force
Yep.
equal and opposite. And then we have this third one, which is force, mass, and acceleration.
Yeah.
When I think of compensation, I'm thinking of equal and opposite. But if I hold the notion of equal and opposite, and I try to hold the notion of force, mass, and acceleration, the notion of acceleration doesn't show up as compensatory. It's another vector of interaction altogether, which can't be held in the notion of this for that, because it isn't in the realm of this for that. It's outside of that conception. So when I'm thinking about something like intuition, I'm not thinking about it in a way that the notion of compensation would even be applied. Because that's to think about compensation is to think about it from sort of an outside in point of view, where I'm basically looking at a system from a sort of third person perspective. And I'm saying for every flow, there's essentially a compensatory flow. But rather, if I'm thinking about it from rather than omniscient or a transcendent point of view, I'm thinking about everywhere from within looking outward. So in other words, as if I was at every point simultaneously in the microscopic and perceiving everything from that simultaneity. There's no notion of compensation there because there's not even a notion of time there. In effect, rather than thinking in terms of a dimension of space or dimensions of time, though time technically isn't a dimension, I'm in this notion of potentiality or what is possible. And so in this sense, when I'm thinking about the notion of intuition, first of all, I'm perceiving in a way that goes beyond the actual and into the potential. You may have heard me make the expression. Jordan used the word faith earlier, and he was sort of holding, like trying to basically articulate a sense in which that concept was valuable to him. And I agree. It's just that the way in which I hold the notion of faith, and Jordan may or may not agree with me here, I'm not sure, but just that I think of it as vision wide open, right? We have our eyes. We can see the physical world around us that is manifest. But as an entrepreneur, I've got to basically be able to have vision about what could be that is not yet. And so in effect, I'm looking at another dimension. The word dimension is actually really incorrectly used in this context, but it's just like there's a kind of transcendental realm, and even that isn't the best way of thinking about it, but just that in effect, it's like acceleration. It's not possible to think about acceleration within the field of just space and objects, right? There's a notion of force and how that force shows up. And so in effect, there's a sense in which when I'm looking at the triple of instinct, intellect, and intuition, and I'm naming that as a triple, and I'm naming it in a sequence. So instinct being immanent, intellect being omniscient, and intuition being transcendent. That there's a sense in which they are going to, in the same sort of way as with any other triple, they're going to manifest in the context of the other two. This is like every manifestation is going to have all three aspects. So for instance, it wouldn't be very hard, for example, for me to assume something like, if I use the word thought, feeling, and emotion, that you would know what I mean. And moreover, that if you've studied the metaphysics, you know the difference between, say, feeling and emotion, right? Emotion having to do with the energy and feeling having to do with the quality. And so in effect, I can then say that instinct is going to manifest through the emotions. Intellect is going to manifest through thinking, and intuition is going to manifest through feeling. So again, these aren't compensatory things. It's not if I have some feeling, I have to have some equal and opposite feeling. It's just that along with anything else, the totality of experience and the totality of expression, and it's not the notion of totality that is even important. It's just the wholeness of it. Right. So, rather than thinking about it existentially, I'm thinking about it in the sense of the real of what is the relationship between the subjective and the objective, my subjective and this objective, and that I'm basically holding that there is a kind of aspect of that flow from the objective towards the perception, which we call towards the subjective, which we call perception, where one aspect of that perception is going to be feeling, and that if I were to try to describe the kinds of perceptions that intuition is about, it's the kind of feeling that extends through and beyond the object to sense the subjective that is altogether elsewhere than my own. So in a certain sense, there's a notion of spirituality, which is how I hold integrity with myself. But through the perfection of my spirituality, I become sensitized to the energies of other subjective, other things. Like if I just think about the subjective objective relationship directly, there's a kind of idealism there that doesn't really hold a kind of awareness of other subjective. But if I'm going to have an intuition about that, or if I'm going to have intuition, I'm going to have to sense the potentiality of the other subjective. And so in effect, there's a kind of non-literal perception that is going on, a kind of echo through the symbolic that we can feel, but that doesn't necessarily have a name or a form, that the same way that feeling doesn't have form, but there's a kind of epiphenomena or a kind of coincidental aspect that shows up as an intuition. So this is, again, kind of closer to how I'm using the term.
Yeah.
I can see, for example, that there are a lot of circumstances, like as you said, if I'm exchanging things in the physical world, like if I'm doing barter, I give you horseshoes for apples or something like that. Or I can essentially abstract away to start talking about virtual goods. So dollars as a symbol, I believe it has value because you believe that they believe that it has value, right? But that's an abstraction. That's a social construct, but is of an entirely different order than what's going on in the, say, of the realm of atoms, right? There's patterns in this sort of abstract social space, which we are manipulating in lieu of actually having to physically take physical objects and carry them around, right? Thinking of like gold as a medium of exchange rather than, say, a fiat currency. But that when we're starting to talk about just the action of being and the way in which we sense and experience and notice the aspects of the totality of that experience, then in effect, instinct, intellect, and intuition becomes kind of a way in which we can sort of discern or parse out aspects of that totality of experience. In the same way we could think about the totality of our experience of emotion, thought, and feeling. So there's a notion here in which as I come to hold these concepts in this particular way, I'll notice that there's certain facilities and that I ask different questions than I otherwise would. So in this sense, when you ask me, what is the transactional component associated with intuition? It's sort of like, well, it's asking how tall am I in fluid inches. It's like, well, or ounces of yes or no. I mean, it's like I'm not sure how to interpret the question. So with that, is the sense in which we are connecting and improved?
For sure. For sure. So I'm not necessarily trying to limit make it compensatory in the sense like, if you do this, then I'll give you that. Or, I want to use a set of relations that I learned from you, actually. I'm going to try it. Self, world, and other.
Uh-huh.
And I'll just use self strictly first.
Uh-huh.
I know I can't separate them, and I know that there's a conjugation.
Oh, this is a great triple to work with. Yeah, I'm glad you picked this one.
Okay.
Joey.
Jordan's saying he's got to go. I'm trying to just raise hand. Yeah.
Yep. Sorry guys, I gotta go. My time is up.
Okay.
I take like 30 seconds to just give my 2 cents on that because I feel like there's like a little piece of richness there.
Absolutely.
And the way I was feeling it, and I think it vibes nice with the way you were saying it, Forrest, is that for me, the experience of intuition is a little bit akin to what the experience might be like of, say, like a cell in my body's perception of communication that's coming from outside. And I would say that the compensation of intuition is participation in a larger wholeness. And so it is that oh, good. Lots of nodding heads. I'm out. Bye, y'all. Much love.
Okay.
See you later, Jordan.
So did that answer you? I mean, actually, that's a very succinct response. It's like,
that was
really
good. It's just like that. That's the experience of it. That's the sense that I was getting, but I was trying to bring it off.
Jordan put it very well, and I think the only way in which I would maybe clarify that in the language of self, world, and other is that the notion of self extends. So as I hold intuition, it's that I'm going into self And that as I go deeper and deeper into self, I notice that the sense of self expands to include more than what I think of just being the egoic me, but it now includes like past lives, or this notion of I am you and you and me, or and like if I feel the life of the world itself.
Yeah.
And so in this particular sense, that whatever we would call that channel of information, I just put the label intuition on it as a placeholder for that sense of increasing contact with the totality of self. And as Jordan put it quite nicely, that is the compensation.
Yes. Yes. That's exactly what I'm talking about. It's
Great. Well,
perfect.
then
It's
met.
perfectly. It's
Yeah.
perfectly put. It's that lands perfectly. Wow.
So, as a piece to share, we've been speaking now for a few hours, and although I feel there's perhaps more to this inquiry that I would love to stay with, I do feel that returning to it, if possible, would be my preference in relation. Just the energy I have, the time we might have, as well as now that Jordan's left, and who knows if John will join us in the future. So I feel as though for me to offer any more would be to open things up for which I'm not sure there is the time and energy, speaking on behalf of myself, to stay with and continue. But I'm also here not wanting to close out. If there's some expression you both would like to share in relation, if you feel there's something still here to relate with in the context of our gathering today.
I personally feel reasonably complete. I'm curious though, because much of what you were speaking to in your most recent remarks as to whether or not you felt that any of that had been answered.
I believe the answer is to come. The answer is in the somewhere in the continuity to realize in potential, through the portal of potential, something like that. I don't know if was I asking anything? I wonder what I was asking. Interesting. It felt like part of what I was speaking forth was an orientation for the potential of shared concern. And that feels like something that has not been fully addressed, but I think is, in a sense, to be addressed through the ongoing care in relationship as a more primary vehicle of communication.
Okay.
Yeah, Joey, how about yourself?
Yeah. I'm grateful for everything that occurred. Like there's so many. I really deeply feel what you're saying about potentiality, Tim. Like the potential. The answer is in the potential. I definitely feel changed. I feel more complete after this. I feel that there is, I mean, I would love to do this, again, or any of that. But there's just, even if it never happened again, like there is a completeness there that I'm just deeply in gratitude for currently. And I just thank you guys for your time and attention and everything that like the build up to this day. It sucks that John couldn't be here, but at the same time it happened how it happened, and that there's always still that presence of John to be like he's always there when anytime I'm in this corner. So that's my main thing here is I'm just grateful for the insights that have already emerged. I've taken like several notes, sticky notes, so that I can just delve deeper into some of the profound things there were some things that were stated here that I don't believe, if the context were different, if it would have emerged somewhere else, I wouldn't be having the insights that I'm having right now. I'm in that space where it's like I'm enjoying the lack of solution. That's my daughter in the back. But I'm enjoying the lack of this is the actual answer and this is the only way that it goes. I'm enjoying the openness of it and the truly living in the potentiality and expressing. It is almost like what Forrest says, like there is profound love here in this, what occurred. It is that choice is now enabled. More choice is enabled.
Well, that's a wonderful place to bring it to a close.